Okay, let's go ahead and get started. We want to welcome everyone for joining us today. And well, if you want to move to the second slide, we'll get going. Hi, I'm John McInturf. I'm a Diligent Recruitment Data Advisor with the National Center for Diligent Recruitment. And joining me and part of this webinar, Candace, I'll let you introduce yourself.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Candace Jones, and I'm the Director of Intensive Technical Assistance with the National Center for Diligent Recruitment. Okay, so guys, the goals of the National Center for Diligent Recruitment are to increase the capacity of states, tribes, and territories to effectively collect and analyze quantitative and qualitative data to guide targeted recruitment, to provide on-site tailored technical assistance to support the work of states, tribes, and territories in constructing their robust, diligent recruitment plans that have significant and strategic outcomes, to develop effective models of diligent recruitment based on evidence-formed and evidence-based research, and finally, to further the evidence base of family finding, relative outreach, reunion support, and intensive recruitment and retention services within the communities of origin of the children and youth in the foster care system.
Okay, kind of give you an agenda of what we're going to be doing today. First, we're going to talk about the question and answer perspective for using data. Then we're going to look at questions that data should answer in your diligent recruitment plans. Then we're going to talk about building a data inventory, also engaging people of color and lived experience. Candace is going to talk about that with you. And then the bulk of the training is going to be about formulating good data questions. Now, we anticipate having some time at the end of the webinar for questions from you participants. So if you have a question during the presentation, please enter those in the question and answer box or in the chat, and we'll have someone monitoring those questions. And hopefully we have time to get to as many of those questions as possible toward the end of the webinar. So let's get started. Okay. The idea of a question to answer perspective comes from the fact that I'm a social worker and many of you are social workers within the child welfare system. So being able to ask the right questions is sort of part of our skill set. And it's really no different when we start to look at asking questions of data. So when doing family assessments or problem solving with families, we use good questions to better understand family strengths and needs. And the same is true with asking data questions, but just as we have to develop skills for those other types of questions to get at family needs or individual needs, we have to develop skills for asking data questions the right way. In most cases, we don't get to ask those questions ourselves of the data, but rather we hand it off to someone who's a data person or an IT person to query the data. And even if you're able to do the query yourself, you want to make sure that you formulate the questions in a way that gets you to the answer requested. So we need to approach data not from the data perspective, but from the question perspective, question to answer. Whether in the process of determining what you want from the data, or when you look at data, determining what question that data is answering for you. So what do we need the data to answer when we talk about diligent recruitment plans? There's really 4 areas when you talk about your diligent recruitment plan of questions that need to be answered by the data. The first questions have to do with placement needs for diligent recruitment, including the MEPA requirements to reflect the racial and ethnic makeup of the children in out-of-home care. Questions about your current placements and need for placement resources by age, race, and other factors related to your placement population. Questions about your current pool of active foster family resources and how they are being utilized. Questions about the effectiveness of your recruitment efforts, of course, and support efforts, and of course, retention of those families. The second area of questions would be about that demonstrate or explain how the goals and actions you put in your plan will change the data or reflect the better outcomes for your children in foster and out-of-home care. Questions that will help you demonstrate how your goals and actions will actually change uh, for the better for children in care, and questions that will help you demonstrate the goals have been achieved. The third section really has to do with implementation, and these questions are how about how your implementation is happening in the way it was prescribed. Questions that will help you monitor activities in your implementation and implementation process, and questions that will help you analyze implementation and allow you for changes when needed in the implementation. And then lastly, questions on the effectiveness of your diligent recruitment efforts, questions on how effective your plan was in changing the outcomes, questions on how effective each of your actions were in achieving your goals, and questions that help you assess the overall effectiveness of your plan. And finally, questions that might help you in making improvements to your next diligent recruitment plan. Okay. So let's talk about building an inventory of good data questions for diligent recruitment. There's a lot of questions we could ask, so we want to do it in a productive way. You begin your data work with building that data inventory of key questions related to diligent recruitment. You start by establishing a team to brainstorm the various questions and then drill down to the key questions you need answered. Development of that team is very important, and Candace's going to talk about that in the next section. You start with the questions, not with the data or the reports you have. And let the questions guide you to the right data, which may already exist in a dashboard or report. But if you start with just looking at the data and not looking at the questions, you might overlook some good data that will benefit you in your planning. If that data does not exist to answer your questions, which in diligent recruitment, we've discovered there's not a lot of data in some jurisdictions to answer your questions, but you can use those questions to determine your data needs and plan for how you can meet those needs. And this, of course, is going to help you when they talk about developing a new system or enhancing your data system. If the question is that important, you can find a way to get or collect that data in another way. It'll also help you look at other forms of data, such as surveys or focus groups, or using spreadsheets to collect data, maybe even on a short-term basis. So Candace is going to talk to you about the team you'll need to do this important work.
Thank you, John. Developing a good diligent recruitment data team includes engaging people of color and those with lived experience to support formulating your data questions. And so one of the things that we champion here is to assume we have all the answers, to assume that we know all the questions. What we embrace is that our lens of experience is different from those who live through what we develop in child welfare systems. And as John mentioned, a well-rounded DR data team is paramount to enhance the quality of our data collection efforts. Having a diverse team helps to broaden the scope of your data analysis by including various perspectives of those responsible for executing and/or those impacted by your diligent recruitment work. Over the years, national child welfare data has highlighted the systemic overrepresentation of people of color by the child welfare system. Also, there's a burgeoning trend of child welfare systems sharing power with youth with lived experience to support the development of policy and practice guidance, as well as sharing power with those families, adults who are also transversing through the child welfare system, including the voices of those who must live through or experience what is designed on their behalf is overall good practice. They help by providing a lived perspective of the work designed on their behalf. Aligning with those we serve and shifting our values to see them as partners will support the development of an equitable system. Next, we'll discuss what you should consider when developing those teams. So first, you should seek input when establishing a common language, determining key questions, formulating data-driven solutions, making decisions during implementation, and analyzing results. Applying a racial equity and a consumer lens to data processes improves how data can be used and its effect on outcomes. Before systems address race equity, it's recommended that they establish a common language to their data presentation. In what areas of data collection and analysis do we need input from people of color and those with lived experience? We need their support with helping determining all of these areas, and in order for us to have that race equity lens in our work. Oxford defines lived experience as personal knowledge about a world gained through direct, firsthand involvement in everyday events, rather than through representation constructed by other people. It may also refer to knowledge of people gained from direct face-to-face interaction rather than through a technological medium. Engaging people of color and those with lived experience enhances your capacity to accurately interpret the data and identify potential root causes. They are likely to identify areas within the system that cannot be computed but experienced. Their perspective is invaluable as they define the helpfulness of interventions and methods created with the intention to serve them. They answer the question, is your help helpful? Helpfulness is tested by those who receive it. Their input helps to ensure your interventions are not addressing symptoms of the problem instead of the problem itself. When considering who to include in your team, it's important to select persons with more recent as well as those with historical experience. Other considerations when developing your team is how they participate, how you prepare them for participation, and compensation for their time. And now I'll turn it back over to John to continue the discussion related to the development of questions.
Okay. Well, the heart of this webinar is talking about uh, how we formulate good data questions. So asking questions of the data is a skill set that we want to kind of teach today. So often what happens is we ask for, what we ask for is not what we receive from the data folks or from the IT folks. And often we are unable to understand a report because we really don't understand the question that was asked of the data and how we can use it. So starting with our basic key questions, we can formulate them into more specific questions that translate into good data questions. So we can communicate them to everyone in terms of what we really want to know. So let's start with two questions that could have come from our team that we just talked about and build on them to look at how we create good data questions. So how quickly, in example one, are our newly licensed families being utilized? This question might have come from a discussion of our licensing, excuse me, licensing families, and whether they're meeting the needs of our children. If they're not being utilized in a timely manner, maybe were they're not the families we should be looking for. It also should come from maybe discussion with our folks with lived experience, saying that, we're getting feedback that placements aren't coming, though we know there is a need. And, where do we want to look at that in terms of our workers not getting the information in a timely way? Or is it just that they're not utilizing them? Or again, these are the kind of questions that could have caused this particular key question to come about. In our second example, just how many of our youth are entering care and going straight to congregate care? This is a question that might help us pinpoint how many resources we need for our teams. It might have come from a discussion of, okay, let's just look and see, how many of our teams are going into non-family settings. In fact, a jurisdiction I worked with once used this type of analysis to put data to targets. What they did was they looked at the different areas of their jurisdiction, and they looked in the past year, and they were, because they lacked the number of foster homes, they realized that many families, children of the same families, were going straight into shelter care. And so a way to put targets, even in specific areas, they took those numbers and made those targets for the coming year, the families they needed to come. So let's look at how we can take these example questions and formulate them into good data questions. So part one, there are three basic parts to a good data question. Part one is you got to define the population. Who are we measuring? Who are we talking about? This is the of part of the question, such as of the or of all and of those. In example one, we could say of all families licensed in the past year. If we want to go back and pick up data on how many placements were taking place there quickly, we would go back. Now, again, this is arbitrary. This would be up to your team to decide. Do you want to go back 5 years and do a trend analysis? But for our example, we're going to say of all families licensed in the past year. In our second example, of all youth receiving their first placement in the past year, is the way we're going to define that population. Now, we could have also defined the population as youth entering custody in the past year. In this case, we're defining it as their first placement in the past year. But keep in mind, because when we go a little bit deeper later in the presentation, we'll look at that population again. Okay. Part two of the good data question addresses what you want to know about that population. This is statements like how many, what percent, what trends might be happening. So in our first example, how many and what percent received a placement within the first 2 months of licensure? Again, we might want to, depending on what we've heard from our group, we might want to stretch it out to 3 months, even 6 months, to get a better idea of their what they want to know. In our second example, we might say how many and what percent had a first placement in a non-family setting. In other words, anything that was not a family could be considered congregate care. So again, we've further defined our question. And it's always good data practice to look at both the numbers and percentages. This is especially true if the numbers are low in one category and the percentages don't look that well after that. The third part three, how you want the data reported for analysis. This is the by part of the question. So the by part of the question would be like such as things like by district or region, by race, by type of placement. In our examples here, we would say, for example, in one, by district and region and by race. In our second example of youth coming into care, we would do it possibly by region or, and when I say district or region, whatever your divisions are, you would use. And then we want it by placement type in case, we want to analyze if it's non-home placement, where are they going? Are they going to shelter care? Are they going to treatment facilities? Whichever. And then we want that by race also. So using race in our presentation of the data puts that racial lens on the data and it becomes part of our analysis. So here's our completed data questions for our data inventory. Example one, of all licensed family in the past year, how many and what percent received a placement within the first 2 months of licensure by district and by race? Sorry, let me pause. I got a message that our chat is not working as expected. So sorry about that. So anyway, that's our first example. And our second example of youth receiving their first placement in the past year, how many and what percent had a first placement in a non-family setting? And we're doing that by district and placement type and race. So you can see the difference between the two questions. Good data questions are written this way so that anybody can understand it. They're not written in technical language necessarily. And really this part of this question should go along with the report or with the graph or whatever so that people can see it. Now, at this point, you may think about forming a smaller team of those with knowledge of the data source. You don't want to exclude those with lived experience or persons of color at this point, but this is an opportunity for probably a smaller group to work to help further define the question so that you can kind of be pulled accurately from the data system. If we were to give this to a data person, they still wouldn't have the detail they need in order to pull the data in the way that you want. So this team will also be helpful in determining that if the data is not in the data system, possibly some other ways to collect the answers to those questions. In the next part of this process, it requires that higher level of specificity and people with knowledge of the system and how the data is captured accurately in the data system and how it's entered. So let's get to leveling up and getting to the data. And this is going to be kind of where it gets in the weeds, but it's very important because this is what makes a good actual report and answers your question. So in our first example, you remember we defined the population of all the families licensed in the past year. So we have to consider that families with a licensing date within the year 2023. That's pretty simple. We go look at the licensing date, and if they were licensed in that time period, that's what we're going to pull. But then here's where we have to think and know the data. We have to decide on the family type. Do we want to pull both relative and foster families? And we might not have thought of that when we were doing the original question. But if we decide to do both, do we need to go back and in our by situation, separate those out, or do we want to keep them together? These are the kind of questions, again, you would go back to the group and ask them and make sure it fits with what their overall question was. So going back to the original question of our newly licensed families being utilized, we might consider not grouping them by family type. And let's kind of wait to the next part of this analysis to kind of see why we would do it, not do that, and where we would take advantage of that. In our second example of youth receiving their first placement in the past year, youth ages 13 and above at the time of placement. You remember in our broad statement, we just said youth, our teens. Here we're defining youth. And again, we want our team to be a part of that. Are we talking about maybe 14-year-olds and above? And again, we have to define these things so that when they go look at the data, we're getting the right answer. Custody date within 2023. Now note that I use custody date instead of placement date here. And you'll remember the question is about those who received their first placement into a congregate care, basically. So why would I use the placement date? Why wouldn't I use the placement date and not the custody date? And again, that's something that you work out. I could have used either. But when we look at that, the next part of that question, you'll see why we might have used custody date instead. Stay with me, folks. This is fun, for me at least. So let's look at what we want to do with that data. We've defined the population. Let's get more specific about what we want. First, we want to count and calculate the percentage of those within a placement date within the first 2 months following their licensure date. Now you see that's pretty simple. But what I want to avoid is picking up families who actually were licensed had a placement prior to licensure, because it really doesn't answer our overall question. So we don't need to include those placements that were prior to licensure date to answer this particular question. Now that might be another question we pose. But if we really allow the person coding this to just say, okay, the date that was prior to 3 months out from licensing date, they would actually pick up these families because they had placements before licensure. So this is something, again, as we get into the weeds of how we want to pull the data, we make sure that we don't get a report that includes those folks that were licensed, that had a placement before their licensing date, and therefore throws off our analysis of how quickly we are placing kids after licensure. Okay, so let's take our second example. So how many and what percentage were placed in non-family settings? We want to count and calculate the percentage of those with a first placement other than foster family or relative care. So do we include or exclude those with a custody date within that year and no placement date? As you're going to know your system and how people enter data. And many times what happens is uh, they might have been put into custody and that date entered, but there was no placement date or placement entered at the time that you're doing this report. So you kind of have to know how people enter data. So if I use the placement date, I'm excluding those youth that were actually in custody, that came into custody for the first time in the past year, and who, but somehow they don't have a placement date or a placement type. So what we might do here is just create a category in the report as unknown and put them there so that we can at least be counted. You can do it either way. And again, these are just kind of the things I want to show you, that as we get into this level of specificity, that we really want to consider so that we get what we want. If you do the placement date, you get the question answered in that way. And you just realize that no, if they don't have a placement date, they're not in this data set. So you would have missed youth who had no placements entered if you do it the other way. Okay. So then we get into how we're going to organize the data. This is where you're really going to use your data folks to help you with this. You want to organize, in our first example, you want to organize by district and race. That's only two categories, one at the top, one on the side. And so that's pretty easy. But you want to determine the best way to organize race. That's not an easy. As you know, in your data system, particularly AFCARs, we capture more than one race. And in a family, there might be multiple races. So you have to spend the time to determine how to organize that data and explain it to the person who's doing it so that you capture race in a way that's useful. You can some use, multiple, you create a category of multiple races, and a family with multiple races is counted in that category, or you can do it individually per individual in that family. When you do that, of course, you're duplicating families, or you duplicating placements. So this is always a factor in determining how you want to do it. But I would say, if anything, be consistent in how you capture this across your reports, unless the report is very specific to not capturing that way. So once you determine how you want to present race, like I say, be consistent in that. You'll also want a total count for each of them, and then, of course, place them in the various regions or districts. Now, again, if you have a good data tool, the report could be, you might have a button that just does per region, and you're able to do that. Or, again, you might do it statewide with regions on one side and race at the top, of the various races at the top, or vice versa. In our second example, by district and region, you want to organize, we have three categories. So you want to organize it by district and region, or district or region, or whatever you call your divisions. Could be county, could be island. Organize the results within district, region, and placement type. So it depends on how you want to do this. I would say in this case, I want it by placement type, and then under that, I want race. But you could do it either way. But I think, again, that's a more equitable way to do it. You'll need total count and percentage for each division of data, and of course, you want to place the results in a chart or a graph that separates these out in this way. My advice is, again, have a good relationship with your data person or IT person. And what they can do many times, and what I've done, is to present the data in a graph and maybe go back to the team, ask them if there might be changes. I might give them different examples. And the whole idea is for you to understand the data from that particular chart. So if you're working with a good data person, they can help you present the data in the best way and the options that best tell you the data story. So hopefully I haven't lost you yet, but there is another level of specificity that your data person can help you with. And then again, that's where you consult your data team. You always have to be in communication with the folks that are looking for the answers and for that for the answers from these specific questions. So the team should be available to not only look at and get ideas of what works best for them, but also to provide input to make sure that what the data you're presenting from the data question is actually answering that question in a way that can help you. So the team should also be available to test the new data to ensure it is accurate. For example, previously we talked about what if we included families that had received a placement prior to licensing. That would have probably come out in testing. People looking at and looking at the data, the population data, and saying, oh, we need to exclude these. And so that would have come in testing. And of course, other things that might come is we have bad data sometimes. And so when we look at it and we realize that this is really not good data, this does not add up, that's where the testing comes in. And testing the data is actually a whole different workshop. So you know, that's something we could, you know, help you with in the future. So I hope that looking at data and data questions in this way has been helpful. You know, I kind of feel like I've gone through it kind of quickly. So let's have some time for questions that we might could answer for you. Anyone have any questions?
Well, I have a question for you, John.
Okay.
What about data collected through surveys? Are there better ways to ask survey questions so that the data can be better used?
Yeah, the difficulty with surveys many times is that we put them out there and we tend to use them maybe over and over, but they don't always get the questions we want answered. So again, I think you start with your data inventory. And when I say data inventory, it would look much like this. It would have our data questions and then population would be part of those questions. And then maybe even how we all the way to the point of how we coded those questions. And what we want from a survey is to make sure that we can we start with those questions first, so that when the survey goes out, we've written those survey questions in a way that gets the answers we need. And many times what we're stuck with is survey questions that come close to answering our question, but don't actually do that. These questions might define the population, you know, as those who completed the survey, but there might be a mixed group within that survey of who actually answered the questions, and we forgot to have those identified. So you need to do that as well. So by creating these questions in this way, where we have the what, and by, we start to develop those survey questions with getting at those answers. And again, running those questions, I would test those questions with people of lived experience to make sure that their understanding of these questions is it getting at what we want. So I hope that answered your question. Any others?
There's another. Do you recommend using a separate team, or could we use an existing group made up of persons of color and lived experience to do this kind of data work?
Candace, you wanna?
Sure, I was going to say, John, you want me to take that one? I would say that that's a very, it depends question. It depends on the nature and makeup of the team that you have that's existing, the purpose of that team, and whether or not they have the capacity to be able to provide you the support you need. It also could, you would also need to weigh their ability to participate in meetings, if they have any other time commitments. The other thing is that you want to diversify the experiences and the voices that you get back from those you serve. So what we see sometimes or have experienced sometimes is that in our systems, we tend to lean on those groups that we've continued to have relationships with, especially youth with lived experience, those who have been prepared and are connected to adults who sort of support them through these efforts. But I would say I would also include young people who may be currently experiencing your system, those who have just recently exited your system, as well as those who may have experienced the system for some time, because then that gives you a different lens of their different experiences that also span the time frame or the different challenges and experiences that your system has gone through, so they can tell you how the system was functioning and give you input on that, as well as the way that your system is currently functioning and how they're experiencing it. And I would say that also consider the who supports them in this work, who supports them after that, because even though we're asking them data related questions, they have to tap into their experiences in order to give you a response of what they believe your direction should be. And in tapping into those experiences, they're also tapping into the emotions connected to those experiences, and they need support after your interaction. So we want to make sure that they're surrounded by a support network that can help them to debrief that experiences, as well as be able to face those questions without having emotionally laden responses. Even though we know that sometimes they do share with us how the experience made them feel, and rightfully so, we want to hear that, because that's the side of child welfare that we don't necessarily have the ability to compute. We can't put a number to how they experience our system. That's the qualitative data piece that we need. And if you want to know how your system, especially if we're looking at historical data, you want to be able to see what the historical experiences were, as well as your current data, what are your current experiences are. And that's why you want to have a wider lens, as well as not wearing those young people or those adults out that have already been participating in groups and providing their input. And again, you want to diversify the group that you're engaging with, so that more than one group of people have an opportunity to share, and widen your lens around what your system really looks like from the experience of those who have to be impacted by it. I hope that answers your question, Kim.
Let me just add, a lot, having experience working with folks with lived experience in this type of data team, you realize that they look at things differently, of course, but we're so focused on our system and how it works from our side, we don't see it from their side. And it's amazing to me when in this questioning part, we might ask the question one way and they ask it a different way, which makes so much more sense, especially when you're developing those surveys. Yeah. Yeah.
Absolutely. I'm glad you brought that up, John, because I think the way that we verbalize questions, or the way that we structure our questions, really have some nuances to it as to how they interpret what we want to know from them. I think that they can also help with the development of those questions with the linguistics that we use when we're formulating questions to yield the outcome or the result that we want. Many times I see young people sort of simplifying questions to their peers, rather than having those multi-layered questions that we sometimes have in child welfare systems. They sort of simplify it and make sure that we're getting to the answer that we want. to know, that we need to know rather than what we want to know. Look at that group. I would say look at any of your external partners, specifically those who are experiencing your system, as those who could tell you what it's like to live through what you develop. What does this feel like? How are you experiencing this? And not to dismiss that, but I think that that's a great opportunity for us to dive deep into that and help us to actually create more questions or more avenues that make us want to be even more curious around what does that look like, so that when we're developing trainings for caregivers, that we're addressing those things that those who experience the home of a caregiver tell you that they need, right?
Right. Very good. Very good. Any other questions?
I am going to read a question from Vita that she put in the Q&A. And I want to encourage all the participants, because we are having issues with our chat, to place questions that you have in the Q&A, and I will read them out loud to you, John and Candace. The next question is, how can we maximize the pool of survey participants?
It's a good question.
Good, very good. Relationships.
Yes, yes, yes.
You have to have relationships. John, I'll take the first part and I'll let you talk about the data part of it. I would say creating relationships with those who directly serve those who are experiencing the system. Of course, we have relationships with our case management staff, but many of our states and tribal partners also use contracted providers, child placing agencies, and the like, or even community-based organizations that serve our children and families. I would say also creating partnerships with them so that they can, who may have direct access to those who have experienced the system. I think the harder part is getting those who are no longer connected to the system to provide us that lens. When we talk about caregivers, again, that's a part and when you're talking about trying to get questions or survey responses from caregivers, again, it goes back to developing relationships with them, maintaining open communication so that you can widen the breadth of the pool that you have when you're sending out a survey to glean responses. But John, I'm sure you probably have some more technical recommendations as well.
Well, some technical, some is on the same lines. Give them feedback. You know, you've done surveys possibly before, and you think, where's this information going? I had a good recommendation, or I had whatever, and I don't know if anybody ever heard it. So good feedback is important. And so like if I'm doing a focus group, I want to make sure that the report that comes from that focus group goes back to the participants, and it lets them know that we did listen, and that we valued what they said. And I think with surveys as well, even though we might just send back aggregate data, many times in our partnerships or whatever, they want to know how that data came about. And so even if we can't, send them the results from everyone, we can aggregate that data and let them know how we've used it. And in actually doing the survey, we can, in that survey, let them know why we're taking the survey, how we're going to use that information, and that that we appreciate them doing this because it's a real value. And again, over time, I think with having these committees and teams work with us, they get the word out that we're really going to use this data to make improvements. And so that you'll see your increase in the use of these surveys, as long as you're, again, showing that you used it or showing them the results so they can see it. And then, if you have any opportunity to show how you've used that data to improve something, that's also valuable. Another question.
And it looks like we have one final question. We have no way to collect data on our recruitment activities and on our certification and training. Do you have some recommendations for how to collect that kind of information?
For most of you, without good data, there's just not, diligent recruitment, there's a lack of data. I just have to, admit that. I've worked with it for a while. Some larger systems have some pretty good systems for collecting even the recruitment data, intake data. Uh, this is a growing field of data collection. Data systems don't naturally collect this because there's no real federal mandate that you report data, except through, again, having a system through the uh, the CFSR process, but you're not actually reporting a set of data. Uh, so we tend to lack data in this area. So doing that data inventory, I think, is very important, because as more jurisdictions do their data inventory, they can assess their data needs that way. I've worked with jurisdictions where we had a number of questions come up and there just was no data. But by knowing that, it gives us, when they come around, and say, we're building a new data system, or what are your data needs? Or if you just want to go to them and say, look, we need this data, it answers our key questions. If we're going to improve our resources for our children, we need a way to collect this data. You have that with your data inventory. You can go to your managers, your IT folks, and tell them what information you need, because it's formalized at that point. And you can not just be guessing or whatever. You can say, we need the data to answer these questions in order to make improvements and to meet the needs of our children in placement. So depending on the size of your jurisdiction, you can look at, using small spreadsheets. You can look at maybe tacking on to some other data tools that might be less expensive. I think, again, the direction of using that data inventory, and then as I say, the data inventory is going to show those gaps. You'd be surprised how opportunities do come along to where that data can be collected and then again reported back to you. I think it's also important because you're asking the questions ahead of time as they come in and they say, what do you want collected? You can define that from not only we need this data entered in, we need to be able to pull it out in this way, because sometimes how it goes in isn't beneficial for how it's pulled out. So be thinking of using that data inventory if you're going to build a good data system, data tools for recruitment. That's what I would advise. So you can, again, get that done. And again, there's continuing to be improvements as people realize we really need this information in order to do a better job. Are there any other questions?
No, that was the last one, John.
All righty. Well, I hope we've been able to inform you a little bit more for your diligent recruitment. I want to kind of go and give you some idea of some resources. You can go to our website, diligentrecruitment.org, and on there we have some resources, and we about data and how to use data in diligent recruitment. We want to thank you for coming. You'll receive an email in the next few days with a certificate of attendance and links to the recording of this webinar, and the direct link to our website, and where you can find these resources highlighted. We'll continue to put resources on our website as they're developed. So continue. You'll also receive a separate email from our evaluation team out of University of Texas at Austin. And hey, here's a survey to gather your feedback about this event. And we do look at those surveys so that we can make improvements. And so if you just take a minute to fill out that survey, those responses will be anonymous, and we really appreciate hearing from you so we can really improve the coming events. So if there's nothing else, we're running a little early, but I can give you some time for the rest of your day. So thanks, and have a good rest of your afternoon, and appreciate you coming.
Thank you all for joining us.